I'm Dr. Tim Boileau, and in this unit we will be talking about learning objectives and assessments. We have a fair amount of material to cover as we'll be going through 2 chapters of the Dick and Carey text, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So I guess we can begin with the question of what is an instructional objective? Well, it's a collection of words. It could also be pictures and diagrams with the intent to let others know what you have in mind for your students to achieve as a result of the instruction. It's related to the intended outcomes rather than the process for achieving those outcomes, which is a very important distinction. Instructional objectives or performance objectives are learner-centered and not teacher-centered. And it is specific and measurable rather than broad and intangible in nature. And just to reiterate, it's concerned with students and not teachers. We can talk about a little bit of terminology since Dick and Carey bring it up in their text. So there are various terms for performance objectives. Behavioral objectives, which was presented by Mager beginning in the 60s with the seminal work that he did. Sometimes they're referred to as learning objectives or instructional objectives. For our purposes, we will be referring to them as performance objectives in the context of Dick and Carey. Performance objectives are always derived from skills in the instructional analysis process. And it's basically what the student will be able to do as a result of the instruction, which is derived from the instructional goals, as we'll be talking about. And subordinate objectives are objectives describing the skills leading to the achievement of a terminal objective. So we have objectives on 2 levels. There is typically one terminal objective for a unit of instruction, whereas there are multiple subordinate objectives. So this table is adapted from Dick and Carey and basically describes how objectives are derived by specifically mapping it to the various steps that we've covered in the ID process. And you can go through this. It's also included in your textbook. We next look at the components of an objective. Well, an objective always describes what is the expected level of performance. In other words, what is the learner expected to be able to do and or produce to be considered competent in terms of demonstrated skills or knowledge in that performance capacity of the objective. We also describe the conditions under which the performance occurs. And finally, the criterion, or what is the level of mastery described by an objective in terms of the criteria for acceptable performance. That is, criterion specifies how well someone would have to perform in order to be considered as competent. There is a process for writing objectives. First, we begin by reviewing the goal statement. Remember, we did goal analysis, task and goal analysis as part of Project B. Here, and in Project C, we did our learner and context analysis. So here, we actually go back to our goal analysis, goal and skills analysis, and review the goal statement before writing your objectives in order to build congruence between the needs assessment, the context analysis, and the subsequent instruction that will be coming later. You then write your terminal objective. Again, this relates specifically to the instructional goal. For every unit of instruction that has a goal, there is a terminal objective. And we write objectives for each of the skills as well as the sub-skills that are included in our instructional analysis. Dick and Carey suggest a set of steps or a procedure for writing objectives. First is to edit the goal in order to reflect the eventual performance context. Next, write the terminal objective to reflect the context of the learning environment. And we got this from our learner and context analysis. Third is to write the objectives for each step in your goal analysis for which there are no subordinate steps. Fourth is to write an objective for each grouping of substeps under a major step of the goal analysis, or write objectives for each substep. And write objectives for all subordinate skills. And finally, write objectives for any entry behaviors that appear below the line, if your targeted learners are likely not to possess them. The other purpose for writing objectives for entry behaviors is for what we refer to as our pre-skills assessment or test, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that brings us to a very quick conclusion of the Dick and Carey chapter on writing performance objectives. There's a lot more information included, which I expect you will read if you have not done so already. And now we will move into our discussion of assessment. And specifically beginning with the purpose of assessment. It is to assess individual students' performances in order to provide information about what kind of revisions are needed to our instructional materials. So this is really the fundamental or the primary purpose of assessment, to make sure that the instruction performs and does what it's intended to do. Assessment is inextricably linked to objectives in instructional design. And what we mean by that is that if I have a goal that I am able to write an objective for, I have to be able to assess performance of that objective. Otherwise, it really isn't an objective. This is also why we look at writing assessments before we get into the instructional strategy or development of materials, why we are interested in this early on in the process, because it will actually guide the conversation. There are two classes of assessment types. The first, and this is where we will spend our focus and time, is with criterion referenced assessments. These determine an individual's level of competence as measured against the objectives for the instruction. Criterion referenced assessments are very learner-centered, and are expected to function as a learning event, thereby encouraging the learner to increase his or her knowledge through self-assessment and development and transfer. The second type of assessments are norm reference tests. The focus here is on ranking students in a normal distribution, or sometimes referred to as a bell curve. It's actually less helpful in assessing an individual's skill or competency level than would be in the case of criterion reference assessment. And again, that is where we will place our focus. So looking at the different types of assessment instruments for criterion reference assessment, we have our entry skills test. From the entry skills test scores, you as the designer are able to make a determination as to whether the learners are ready to begin the instruction. We also have a pre-test or pre-assessment, and based on the pre-test scores, the designer decides whether the instruction would be too elementary for learners. The entry skills test and the pre-test are often combined in one. In other instances, if there are no identifiable prerequisite skills, it wouldn't be necessary to have an entry skills test. Likewise, if we know that this is new training or new skills development for our audience that they have not encountered, we might not even do a pre-test. So there is some flexibility in here, dictated by the needs of your instruction and the nature of the instruction through your front-end analysis. This is followed by practice assessments. These are for the benefit of the learner. It enables the learners to rehearse the new knowledge and skills in order to judge for themselves their level of understanding and skills, and this also aids in transfer of learning. And then finally, our post-test or post-assessment. This is parallel to the pre-test. It is used to determine the amount of learning that's taking place. We do a pre-test, we do a post-test, and we measure the improvement between the two. Now, I said that it's parallel to the pre-test. It's similar in many ways. However, It does not include items on entry skills, which is a difference. Rather, it measures the objectives that are included in the instruction itself. I've included an assessment comparison, and again, this is an adaptation from the table that's provided on page 134 of the Dick and Carey text, which looks at the designer's decision points and the objectives that are typically tested as associated with each of the 4 assessment types. We have our entry assessment, pre-test, as well as practice test and post-test. So I leave that for your reference and review. There are a set of characteristics that are associated with good assessment instruments. One is the validity. Does the assessment measure what it claims to measure? And here, in terms of measures of validity, we have what we refer to as the 5 C's. Congruency between the goals, objectives, and assessments, completeness, consistency, confidence, and cost. Cost is the time invested in developing the assessment, and as well as the time to administer and grade the assessment. Is there value? Is there a return on that investment, or a positive value proposition? The second characteristic is that of reliability. Is there a high degree of confidence in the scores that the assessment produces? In other words, is it repeatable? And there are a number of questions that we ask in terms of evaluating our assessment instruments. Does the test measure what should be measured? Is there anything missing, such as a critical task, skill, concept, or procedure that we want to test for that is captured in our objectives? Is the test too hard? Is it written in a different context or setting than what our learners are capable of? Does the test adequately delve into the depth of knowledge that learners should have and should be able to demonstrate as a result of the instruction? We look at mastery levels in terms that this comes from writing our objectives, and mastery levels do carry forward into assessments as well, and this is what we are testing for. It's the criterion specified in the objective determines the mastery level for the assessment, whereas ideally there is an explicit level of performance that defines the level of mastery that is required. For important skills, there should be multiple assessment opportunities in the form of practice assessments if the mastery level with an associated objective is very high. And in general, the mastery level for any performance should be considered with respect to both evaluating the performance at that point in time, as well as enhancing learning of subsequent related skills in the unit or in the remainder of the course. So we tend to design assessment items based on the learning domain, and this should be familiar to you from your goal analysis. Specifically, if we are testing objectives that relate to the verbal information learning domain, we would use test items such as short answers, alternative response, matching, and multiple choice items. For intellectual skills, this usually involves the demonstration of creativity through the creation of a product, some live performance that is observable, the development of a checklist or a rubric. For psychomotor skills, the types of assessment items would be directions on how to demonstrate the task using a checklist or rubric in order to evaluate the performance. And to assess attitudes, this is generally done through a self-report of attitudes or inference drawn from observation. Now, in the textbook, they cover a variety of different examples in each of these domains. My intent here is simply to provide a summary for you. As well, with cognitive strategies, the types of assessment items would be similar to intellectual skills, and this is primarily observed problem solving. So when we begin to write assessment items, we look at a variety of test item criteria, and specifically there are 4. We have goal-centered criteria, which focus on the items and tasks congruent with the terminal and performance objectives. It is critical that the test items match the exact behavior which is described in your objectives. We also have learner-centered criteria, whereby the items must be tailored to the characteristics and needs of the learner following your learner analysis. And these would be cultural needs, developmental needs, motivational characteristics, etc. Context-centered criteria refer to the consideration of the performance setting and the learning environment. And finally, assessment-centered criteria places attention on style, clarity, in your instructions, and formatting to avoid ambiguity by providing adequate instruction for how to complete the assessment. In terms of developing assessment items, again, assessment items are restatements of objectives. Once I write my objectives, I can write my test or create my assessment items. And incidentally, the reverse is also true. If you have a well-written assessment, you can actually work backwards and derive your objectives from the assessment items. There is a direct relationship between your objectives and your assessment items. Assessment items are designed to measure and evaluate skills in several types. And again, using different examples, forced choice test items require learners to select among a set of response options. These would be your true, false, multiple choice, etc. I generally try to stay away from forced choice assessment items because they are a test of luck as much as they are skill. Particularly with true, false items, you always have a 50-50 shot of getting it right, whether you possess the skills or knowledge or not. Short answer type test items are useful in recalling correct answer with few cues. Essay items require students to recall information using minimum cues and then to organize it into a meaningful and persuasive piece of writing. Reflection and case analysis assess learner engagement with an application of new knowledge. And when we are in performance-based assessment items, such as an instructional design course, we base our assessment on a portfolio as a collection of the student's work. In our case, the example that I would provide is at the end of the course, we will be combining all of our individual projects into a complete instructional design package that will be submitted via the TK20 system. And again, in this case, I've simply recreated a table provided in the Dick and Carey text, in this instance on page 140, which summarizes the different types of assessment items and what type of behavior they would map to based on how you've written your objectives. Now, this is not covered in Dick and Carey. This actually comes from a complementary text by Smith and Reagan. But this is a tool for the designer to use in documenting your assessments. And I would like you to do this to make sure that you are covering each of your objectives that are identified in the analysis of your goals and tasks. And the blueprint for your assessment should include your objectives, the form of the items, and this is just reading the columns from left to right. So list your objectives out. What is the assessment form? So is it multiple choice, essays, performance-based observation, the short answer, etc. The number of items or test items that are required for each objective. So the total items in the instrument, as well as the directions for administration, the scoring methods, weighting of the items, and a passing or cutoff level. So this is a useful exercise, and I have provided a job aid for you in the course materials folder to assist you with that.